to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itchon, COO, and it's a Thanksgiving week holiday, so we're going to go right into the podcast. Our guest this week is Scott Beyer. Scott is the founder of The Market Urbanist, which is really doing some great reporting and research on free market solutions for our cities. Now, Steve Greenhut, who many of you may know runs our Free City Center, tapped Scott to do our latest mini book, the subject which is Latin America's urban experience. And that's also the subject of this podcast, some of the innovative things that urban cities are doing in Latin America without government's heavy hand. Now, keep in mind that we're not advocating that we go out and try all of this tomorrow. These living conditions, these transportation modes, they're not ideal. But in some cases, they're better than what the U.S. offers now. We could learn from what these Latin American cities are doing. Scott is currently on a tour of the cities in 3 continents. He began with Latin America, then Africa, then ending in Asia. So we caught up with Scott in Kuala Lumpur. He had to do this interview pretty late at night. Nevertheless, I think you're going to find this interview really fascinating. And you can download the mini book on our website at pacificresearch.org. So just one quick announcement. If you haven't already signed up, PRI Senior Director in Education, Lance Izumi, will be giving a luncheon talk on November 30th at the Pacific Club in Newport Beach. He's going to discuss the aftermath of the Supreme Court's decision on the Harvard, North Carolina case on discrimination, this case Asian Americans. The courts effectively outlawed racial discrimination at universities. So Lance is going to discuss the implications of this decision and what it means for K-12 education. Thanks, everyone, for listening. And here's Scott Beyer. Welcome to PRI's Next Round podcast, Scott.
Thank you, Rowena.
So we're delighted to have you on Next Round to talk about your terrific new Free Cities Center booklet, Latin America's Urban Experience, which our listeners can download on pacificresearch.org. But before we begin talking about your book, let's talk a little bit about you. So you're the editor of The Market Urbanist. So tell us about your work and how our listeners can follow what you do.
Sure. So I'm one of the main people who writes about a concept called market urbanism, which we can get into in more detail. But the basis of market urbanism is it's the cross between free market policy and urban issues. And it's really exploring how free market classical liberal ideas can apply to specifically urban issues like housing, transportation, public administration. My company, The Market Urbanist, is really, there's multiple people who write about market urbanism, and it's kind of a larger movement. But my company, The Market Urbanist, is designed to really bring market urbanism ideas into cities, not only from an academic level, but more of a political level as well. So it's some mix of publishing articles and various podcasts, but it's also, we do a little bit of consultancy and advocacy work with different organizations. And so the main goal of the organization is really just to push governments towards these ideas.
So your new booklet covers your trip through Latin America from Mexico to Ecuador from July through December of 2022. And on your trip, you explored some ideas for urban renewal that, well, folks in the United States might learn some lessons from. So what prompted your going on this Latin American tour, and what were your goals when you sat down to start writing the book?
Sure. So it's part of a bigger tour, which is why I'm calling from Malaysia right now. But yeah, basically in July of 2022, I decided to do a 1.5-year tour of the global South. So I'm originally from Charlottesville, Virginia. That's where I was based at the time of leaving. And I decided to do 6 months in Latin America, 6 months in Africa, 6 months in Asia. So the trip is kind of let's say 80% done. And I'm like I said, I'm calling from Southeast Asia. But Latin America was the first leg on my trip. And that's really where I began to experience the developing world. And your editor, Stephen Greenhut, who was tracking the tour, reached out and said, well, why don't you turn all of these findings into a book?
That's great, Scott. So, Scott, you write in your booklet that for all of its high-level socialism, Latin America is in many ways a place where it's easier to own a home, start a business, move and live as you choose. Going on your extensive tour and thinking about politics and policy in the U.S., why do you think that is?
Well, yeah. So the dichotomy that I'm finding as I travel not only through Latin America but the larger third world is that at the high level. So we're talking about the federal government and the larger political philosophy therein is typically more socialist. And there's a lot of socialism in Latin America. In other parts of the third world, they're still dealing with monarchy and kingdoms. So it in that sense, yes, it's a problem of top-down governance. But kind of the contrast that I found is that once you actually get out on the streets and get down to the block level, you're actually finding something like the opposite, which is that much of the economies in these types of places are informal in the sense that they don't have government licensure. And it's kind of like a free market free-for-all in a sense. So, for example, if you're walking through a typical mercado or central market in Latin America, first off, there's going to be businesses and commerce everywhere down the street. And quite a lot of those businesses that you see will not have any formal licensure. They're technically illegal, but they're sort of like an organic free market that exists at the street level because they're simply selling what other people want. So in that sense, it's more, it's kind of like I don't want to say libertarian, because libertarianism also often comes with rules and regulations in itself, but it's kind of like a free market, so to speak.
So, Scott, let's dive into some of the issues that you cover in the booklet. So on housing, we're all familiar with the home affordability and home availability crises in California and other states, yet you profile several models for zoning laws and types of housing that West Coast policymakers might learn a thing or two about. So share with our listeners some of what you learned.
Sure. So I think the fastest way to put it would be to say that in Latin America, housing can be built closer to the jobs and to where people actually want to live because there is less government oversight and institutions stopping that from happening. With that stated, there's really two layers to this that I mentioned in the book. So most Latin American cities are divided between the formal part and the informal part. So just to give you an example, like Rio de Janeiro, the places like Leblon and Ipanema and Copacabana, all of the famous beach neighborhoods, those are technically the formal areas of the city. And then when you get up into the mountains and the hills, you have a bunch of what's called favelas, which are informal, illegal settlements that look out over the city. But either way, whether you're talking about the formal or you're talking about the informal parts of a Latin American city, they all have less regulation than the US. So the formal parts, I'm not going to say they don't have any regulation at all, but there aren't the sort of codified zoning regimes that exist in the US cities. And then when you get up in the hills, it's a complete free-for-all. There's no zoning at all. Everything that gets built is illegal. It's designed for a extremely low income group, often people who can only afford to pay maybe $40 or $50 a month in rent, if that. So we're talking mud huts, cinder block homes, zero frills, kind of just your typical third world settlement. And so that might seem bad to a lot of people, but what you can say is that people in Latin American cities can settle and live affordably close to where the opportunity is. And so kind of like what I was talking about the commerce before, I'm not going to say it's absolute free market, but it's a more organic way to meet market needs than you're going to see in any American city, much less the ones in California.
So, given that, description of the types of housing, some readers might worry that you might be suggesting the creation of shanty towns, for example, in the United States as a way to address our high housing costs. How would you address that critique?
Well, I'd say that if you go to particularly the West Coast cities, I'm thinking specifically of like California, Skid Row in California, and the Tenderloin in San Francisco. I would say that what they have is actually worse than shanty towns, which is you've got hundreds of people living in absolute squalor right there out on the street, great intents. So the shanty towns of Latin America are actually quite a lot more sophisticated than that. They have, and a lot of it is provided by the private sector. They have roads and commerce, and they have actual building structures that people get to live in and at least stay clear of the elements and have some level of personal safety. So no, it's not perfect. It's not a perfect setup. But given their income levels, I'd say that they have a higher standard of living than, say, somebody who's living under a bridge in Los Angeles. So, I mean, I guess to turn this into an official policy package, you might say that having a shanty in Los Angeles that is a deeply affordable form of housing for very, very low income people would actually be an improvement.
So let's turn to transportation. When we think of government transportation, we think of the boondoggles like high-speed rail in California and millions stuck in traffic, gridlock every day despite paying higher taxes. But you profile several market-driven transportation networks that have popped up in Latin America that are serving what was an unmet need in their communities. Tell us a little about some of these alternatives, and could they be replicated in the U.S.?
Yeah, so it's interesting, like, especially having traveled through Africa by now as well. I saw an even more extreme version of it in Africa, which is that the third world has a lot of what I would call I've called them insta taxis before, or also micromobility. But there's a whole lot of like motorbikes and tuk-tuks, which are little rickshaw, three-wheel taxis, jitney buses. They're very small vehicles, and they kind of camp out in the corners and in an informal way. Because again, so much about Latin American cities are in fact informal. So they'll kind of just camp out where the needs are greatest and where they know they're going to get the most customers. And it becomes a way of, if you need to get somewhere in Latin America, you can hail things very quickly. You can either hail it on Uber, or you can get a tuk-tuk or a jitney bus or a motorbike taxi, and they'll take you places very quickly for very cheap. So the thing that I like about the system is it's decentralized. It goes from point A to point B. It's cheap, and it's a mix of many different entrepreneurs all adding to a larger system. So contrast this with the centralized pro-government transit systems that we have in California, where you basically have a lot of fixed infrastructure, you have fixed routes, you have government unions, and those are the people who actually operate the vehicles. You have bureaucrats who are not necessarily thriving on the profit motive, and so they don't have an incentive to provide really good service. They're the ones managing the system. And I would say that it's just interesting to me because like one of these systems that I described requires a lot of fixed infrastructure. It costs a lot of money to taxpayers. It loses money every year. The other system that I described in Latin America costs very little money, if any at all, and is completely decentralized and is for profit and provides jobs for people. So yeah, I think we in the US have a lot to learn about allowing these decentralized systems in our own cities.
So let's talk about planning and administration. Anyone who stood in line at the post office or the DMV or any government agency knows that, our state and local government in California and other Western states, they're providing government services pretty inefficiently. So one system that you profile in your booklet is called a favela, which they're not really official and they're kind of illegal, but in many cases, you note that they are providing services more efficiently, and the people doing them are private entities. So are there any lessons that you learned from seeing favelas up close that could be applied to improving city services in the United States?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of self-governance in favelas. So they oftentimes have private police forces. You might even call them mafias that ensure that violence doesn't get out of control. You oftentimes have private road networks and private alleyways. So building owners will collaborate with one another to allow walking paths through the neighborhood, because that helps their profit bottom line. If you have a building that does not have walkways leading to it, then you're not going to sell very many units. And so it's another case where like a basic infrastructure surrounding the building actually is actually in the profit motive of all the people constructing in the neighborhood. And yeah, there's like a bunch of kind of like they're very retail rich type of places because there's not a lot of regulation preventing goods and services from being provided. So you'll walk up and down the streets and there's like fruit stands and little knickknack shops going all up and down the alleyways. I think where governance of a favela falls apart and really gets into the debate of like how much government is needed and how much collective action problems are going to be created without a government is the fact that a lot of basic utilities that we take for granted are not really provided in the favela because you don't have that government. You don't have a private sector that is willing to serve that population, and you don't have the government coming in and really taking the place. So you'll have sewage runoff and unclean water and things of that nature.
So, Scott, you probably heard of this massive proposed startup city in Solana County, and it's generated a lot of negative media headlines and NIMBY opposition. But in your booklet, you profile several examples of startup cities in Latin America that were set up based on free market principles. Share with us what you saw, and could we ever see cities like these in the U.S.?
Yeah, so the startup city model is really the most interesting public administration thing that I'm finding on my trip, not only in Latin America, but really Africa and Asia as well. I would say those continents are ahead of us in the US on this model. But basically, not all startup cities are the same, but generally they have some sort of special jurisdiction status. Like maybe they're a special economic zone or a free trade zone, or they might just be a large plot of land that has a lot of autonomy for one reason or another from the surrounding jurisdiction. So they have self-governance. They have a heavy dose of self-governance. They often have their own tax and regulatory structures. They have their own land use codes or lack thereof. I'd say the most interesting thing about them is they're privately managed. So they are providing all the services that typically a municipal government provides. And I think the key is that they're providing them much better. So I visited a number of startup cities, for example, in southern Brazil, and here's what they provided: clean water, security, oftentimes their own energy grid, and like a lot of the public governance, such as city hall and democratic governance had been replaced with private management. They provided their own parks. Some of them were even providing their own public transportation, on and on and on. So they're basically like replacing the traditional idea of a municipal governance with a private entity that is for profit. And I think it'll be really interesting because we need to have more competition in this space. And I think that if a startup city is showing through private governance that it can provide these things much better than the municipalities in Brazil or Colombia or what have you are providing things, then that I think makes a really strong statement for privatization.
So finally, Scott, now that you've completed the Latin American journey of your trip, what one market-based idea from your journey do you believe could garner the political support necessary to be enacted in a big city like a San Francisco or Los Angeles and start to improve the lives of the citizens there who are suffering under their current broken city governments?
So to me, the single best idea that I've found, and whether it's going to get political muster, I would not know, but Kigali, Rwanda, and to a lesser extent other cities, but Kigali was the best one that I saw, had this big, massive moto taxi system. And a moto taxi, the definition of a moto taxi is a motorcycle that somebody uses as a taxi. So if you go to Kigali and you walk out on the street, you will see absolutely thousands and thousands of regulated for-profit moto taxis. They're all the color red. Every single driver wears the color red. The passenger is required to wear a helmet, so the driver usually carries a helmet along with them. They're not driving psychotically like they do in other African cities, like they actually have to follow rules. But I thought the system was just amazing. It was the most amazing mass transport system I have ever seen, because you just walk out on the street, you raise your arm, and somebody comes to pick you up within 20 seconds. And you quickly negotiate, you tell them where you need to go, you quickly negotiate the price, and boom, you're there. Like the motorcycle is even faster than an automobile because they can kind of like veer through the small spaces of the city. So I'm looking at this and I'm like, why do we not have this in the United States? Like, people in San Francisco and New York are dealing with all this gridlock. They're having to wait 15 minutes for a train. The train doesn't go exactly where they need them to go. Why don't we just deploy a bunch of regulated moto taxis out on the street? It would create thousands of jobs. It would dramatically improve the mobility. And I think more to the point of the libertarian message, it would get the government out of this industry. Instead of having to hose the taxpayers to continue to build all this light rail and all these bullet trains and everything, why not just have a cheap, for-profit, decentralized system that costs the taxpayers nothing?
Scott, that's really a cool idea. So for our last question, we call our podcast Next Round because of PRI's proximity to wine country and our love of discussing politics and policy over a glass of great California wine. So you've been all over the world. You've been in Latin America, Asia, Africa. What wine, beer, cocktail, or other beverage are you enjoying as you do your world tour?
So I actually do not drink. So my favorite drink back when I used to was I really like Southern whiskey in the region that I'm from in Virginia. I've always liked the caramelized flavor of it. But yeah, I stopped drinking when I went on the trip just because there was so much other stuff to do. Like I just didn't really have time for it. And so ideally, I could report all kinds of wonderful beverages that I'm drinking around the world.
Scott, tell us about some of your non-alcoholic beverages that you've been drinking. We'd be interested to know about that.
Yeah. Okay. So I think something that's really cool about the third world that does not exist anywhere in America that I can think of is there's a lot of street food and there's also a lot of street beverages. So a lot of fruits and vegetables are picked from the surrounding farms because these are very agrarian societies still. Like they're not mechanized. There's not cold storage and so forth. So a lot of like the avocados and the tomatoes and the oranges and the mangoes that are picked from nearby farms are brought in that day to be sold at market. And a lot of people make juices out of them. So I would say like a typical daily thing for me is just to buy a fresh squeezed juice off the street. They usually cost less than $1. It's been like one of the highlights of my trip.
Scott, thanks so much. And thanks for staying up from Kuala Lumpur to do the podcast with us.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.